Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to, I believe, the first NLP talk of the autumn quarter, 2019. We're live streaming thanks to some very nimble help from computer science and engineering support. We're broadcasting live. I'm delighted today to introduce two speakers. I'll introduce the first one, we'll hear the talk, and then after questions we'll move to the second speaker, and I'll introduce him when it's time, assuming his slides are ready when it's time for him. Okay, no pressure. So first up today we have Nathan Schneider, who is an assistant professor in computer science and linguistics at Georgetown University, where he's been for about 3 years. Prior to that, he was a postdoc at the University of Edinburgh, working with Mark Steedman, and prior to that, he was a PhD student working in my group back when we were at Carnegie Mellon. Nathan is known for a wide range of exciting research in the area of broad coverage natural language semantics. He is very much at the linguistics extreme of computational linguistics and NLP, and has contributed new data sets and lots of new thinking about what we ought to be modeling, in addition to models themselves. One of the things that makes him sort of unprecedented in my group while he was a PhD student, he was essentially running his own annotation shop and building new data sets and managing a team of linguists to create, in particular, new data sets around multi-word expressions, which form the core of his thesis. So if you're a student working in NLP, don't let your student status stop you from being innovative about the data. Nathan has set a nice precedent. So he's going to talk to us today about preposition semantics, and with that, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Noah, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm thrilled to be here. This is my first time in this building since 2008, I think, so it's great to be back. And to have such a great group around NLP. This is kind of one of the epicenters of NLP in the US, and so I'm looking forward to sharing some of the stuff that I'm working on, and Vivek as well. To just give the general background, fitting with what Noah started off, the sorts of questions I'm interested in and people in my lab at Georgetown are generally under the umbrella of working with linguistically inspired analyses of text. So in particular, what linguistically inspired analyses can we obtain from both human annotators and machines with machine learning and so forth, with a focus on making these analyses accurate, robust, efficient, comprehensive, and covering text corpora ideally in lots of domains and languages around the world. To set the background a little bit here, we can ask, what does meaning look like, or what should it look like if we want to get systems that understand meaning and can communicate with human-style language. And of course, the sort of de facto in our field right now is that to a large extent, we sort of express meaning with some sort of vector representations or matrices or tensors. And these are learned in a complicated neural network, and they are very good at capturing certain regularities in text, but they are also really hard to understand as a human what sorts of generalizations they are capturing. But of course, there's a huge tradition in computational linguistics and NLP of thinking about meaning in other ways, whether it's some sort of relationship between sentence pairs, whether it's some sort of graph-based representation of predicate argument structure and stuff like that. So this is an example of AMR, the abstract meaning representation, or whether it's some sort of more formal logical semantics that has scope and stuff like that. So these are all sorts of things that are on the table and that I think are valuable research directions. My own perspective is that it's not like one of these is the correct way and the others are incorrect, but rather they have different design goals and are targeting sort of different aspects of meaning. I like to think of meaning as a really rich cake that has lots of layers, and we can think about the more lexical aspects of meaning, maybe in a very abstract way that sort of generalizes well across languages. Or we could think about more specific, like lexicon entries, like the difference between a dog and a cat, or more abstract nouns and verbs and so forth, where we might need language-specific lexical resources. Or we may think about sort of more structural aspects of how meanings come together, semantic relations that show up in text. And this could be also tied to a lexicon. And then at the top of sort of semantics, we have the most detailed representation perhaps is some sort of formal logic that has that you can do inference on in a formal way, symbolic inference. And then, of course, there are other dimensions of meaning that are not simply semantics, but involve pragmatics, world knowledge, social meaning, and so forth. So my general perspective is that we need to look at different layers of this cake and try to understand how the layers fit together or could be made to be more interoperable, and how they relate to things like neural language models. OK, so the particular focus of this talk is going to be on adpositions. Adposition is a term in linguistics that covers prepositions and postpositions. Prepositions are things we have in English, like in, on, at, by, for. These are these words that help connect two things together. Usually, prepositions are followed by a noun or noun phrase. And other languages have prepositions like French and German, but languages like Korean and Japanese and Hindi, Urdu have postpositions, and so that just means it comes after the noun phrase. This talk is mostly going to be about prepositions in English, but then adposition is a more general term when I start talking about other languages. And we can look at the typological surveys of the languages of the world, and we see that there are some interesting geographic distributions of prepositions versus postpositions. The red ones, the red dots are prepositional languages, so you see most of the languages of Europe, sub-Saharan Africa, I guess, and Polynesia, and you see concentrations of postpositional languages in different areas of the world. So this whole study, so prepositions are really fundamental, it seems, or adpositions are really fundamental to the way grammatical structure and meaning gets put together in many languages, or if not most languages. So I'm going to be talking about a project about focusing on the meaning of adpositions that started as a collaboration between myself and Vivek and Jenna Huang, who's now at AI2. And it's not a coincidence that Vivek and I are here today. We wanted to coordinate our visit to meet with Jenna and hash out some new directions in this project. But we could not have done it alone. There have been many collaborators over the years. We started working on this in 2014, and we're still working on it because adpositions are so darn complicated. And so we have gained many collaborators from places like the University of Colorado Boulder and my own students at Georgetown and other people who have been involved in different aspects of this project. OK, so why should we care about preposition semantics or adposition semantics? So when I go to a conference like ACL and I mention, someone says, what are you working on? And I say, I work on preposition semantics. I get one of two responses. If I'm talking to a computer scientist, I get a sort of a blank stare often, like, what? I thought prepositions didn't have meaning. They're like stop words. We throw them out. Like, what? Why does this even make sense? On the other hand, if I'm talking to someone with a lot of linguistic training, I get sort of a look of pity because linguists know that adpositions are just incredibly complicated and enmeshed in all kinds of parts of grammar and different from language to language. So it's a really challenging topic, but also relevant to NLP. And so the best argument I have found for why we should care is this little cartoon that somebody put on the internet. This is Wilbur, and he has a sign saying, "Will work as food." And the caption is, "Due to his grammar mistake, Wilbur found a position, it just wasn't the one he wanted." So the culprit here is this little word as. And maybe Wilbur was not a native speaker of English. Maybe his native language was Pig Latin. But he clearly meant to say will work for food. And he said he will work as food. And things ended tragically for Wilbur because of this. So this shows that this little word has an important meaning and leads to very different interpretation of the sentence. But it's not just cartoons. We can also find examples of real language where prepositions are ambiguous even to readers. So I saw this the other day and was like, what's going on? Senator Dianne Feinstein laying the groundwork to sue DOJ for release of the whistleblower report. So DOJ is the Department of Justice. She is suing for release of the whistleblower report. So does this mean, who thinks this means she wants the release of the whistleblower report? And who thinks this means she is suing because somebody released the whistleblower report? Okay, so some people answered both. I was surprised to see this because my initial reaction was the second one, just from reading the sentence, that you sue someone because of something they did, like you are challenging what they did. But the actual intended reading from context is that she wants the whistleblower report to be released, and the government is, DOJ is withholding it. This shows an important way that this little word is leads to different outcomes, maybe different interpretation of the sentiment of or opinion of Dianne Feinstein with regard to release of the whistleblower report and so forth. So we want ways to handle this, to formalize this and handle this in NLP. I couldn't resist, given what day it is today, this one also with for how to actually apologize for Yom Kippur. This does not mean apologize for the existence of Yom Kippur. It means apologize to people on the occasion of Yom Kippur, because that's what you're supposed to do on Yom Kippur. And then finally, this one, smoke detector installed on, and somebody filled in the ceiling, somebody being a bit of a smart aleck. So these are all ambiguities of prepositions that are very clear to us as human readers. And of course, many of the things that, most of the time we don't even notice this because we have such good world knowledge that we're able to disambiguate as humans. Another reason that I think prepositions are really interesting is that they're extremely frequent. Something like 10% of tokens in text will be prepositions in English. This is a word cloud distribution for English words, and you see function words, are extremely frequent, and the red ones are all prepositions. So this is, if you could better account for the meanings of these things, you would be covering more of the data, a lot more of the data. And but the challenge here is that with great frequency comes great polysemy. So you take a word like for, you already saw a few of the meanings. It can be leave for Paris, where it's somewhere you're going, eat for hours, all these other meanings. And we can give them sort of descriptive labels. With many very similar meanings are expressed by other prepositions like to and on, and maybe you have to change a little bit of the context, but you get a similar meaning. So our goal is going to be to come up with a set of these labels that we have definitions for, and we can apply to disambiguate prepositions in English. So we can characterize these ambiguities. So with will work as food, the reason that it gets a funny interpretation is that as here has an identity sort of meaning Wilbur is being equated with food, versus the intended sentence was will work for food, where food is somehow related to the purpose of work. the installed on the ceiling example, we're talking about a locus or location versus a time, which is probably the intended use of that blank line. And with the suing for release of the report, it's a purpose. Do you want the report to be released versus an explanation? Why are you suing? Or what was done that you are suing in response to? Okay, so the challenge here in coming up with a set of labels, it's pretty natural to say, location, time, purpose, et cetera, in principle. But prepositions are not just about space and time, even though they're sort of rooted in space and time, but then they get extended to all kinds of other meanings. And so pretty much any kind of, almost any kind of semantic relationship between two entities or an entity and an event or two events can be expressed, at least in English, with preposition. So things like causality and intention and comparison and emotion and all this stuff involve prepositions in some cases. Why is this interesting for NLP? Well, I've sketched out a disambiguation task. We know from syntactic parsing that PP attachment is is a difficult part of that. So maybe if we had semantics, we could do better at that, or vice versa. If you want to build some sort of explicit meaning representation, like a graph-based meaning representation, prepositions are going to be an important signal in the training data. And I'm especially interested in these because they're sort of in between the lexicon and the grammar of a language, and they help you see the meaning distinctions that a language considers important enough to be grammaticalized, to be really tied to different, very productive uses. We also might want these for working with second language data, helping second language learners. Here was an example I saw in a Starbucks in Korea. It was translated as seat available on upstairs. And while this is perfectly understandable, it's clearly not the way a native speaker would express this. So there's all kinds of subtleties in the way prepositions are used within a particular, or adpositions are used within a particular language, and they're very difficult to learn as a second language speaker. Relatedly, machine translation makes a lot of preposition errors, and so maybe we should use some sort of explicit semantics there as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk about an approach that we published at ACL 2018, and this focuses on 3 different dimensions. First, we had to develop a descriptive theory of what are these labels that we're going to assign, how do we define them, how do we train annotators to apply them. Secondly, we created a data set where all of the types and tokens of prepositions have been annotated with these semantic labels. And finally, we did some experiments with disambiguation. I should first acknowledge that we were not the first to think about preposition meanings in a computational setting. The sort of groundbreaking work here was done by Ken Litkowski and Orrin Hargraves. They built a large lexicon of preposition, very fine-grained preposition senses that they applied to corpora. And there were some shared tasks on disambiguation and so forth. There's also literatures in linguistics, especially cognitive linguistics, on how these preposition meanings can get extended and new meanings can be added based on the old ones. There's also work on general purpose semantic relations, and this is a little bit closer to the way we approach the problem, is that we have we're coming up with a fixed set of labels that we are trying to disambiguate into, that have human interpretable names, rather than being very specific to each preposition. So there was some work on semantic relations. Our work is, however, the first of these class-based approaches that is comprehensive with respect to tokens and types. meaning if I give you a sentence, I want to, or a corpus, I want to have a system that tags all of the prepositions with some sort of semantic label. Annotate all the prepositions. Okay, so our approach is with these coarse-grained labels that I've already started to show you. We call them supersenses. Supersense meaning higher level, more abstract than a traditional sense. And so they look like this. So if you say the cat is on the mat in the kitchen on a Sunday in the afternoon, we're going to cluster together these two as locus or location, and these two as time. Okay? And so we are not capturing, I want to be very clear, we're not capturing the full meaning of these prepositions. You can't swap, you can't say the cat is in the mat on the kitchen. These are not interchangeable, but in this context they have, these contexts they have a very clear locational meaning. These contexts is the time meaning. We are comprehensive. We want to tag all of the instances. And we also include possessives because of is a preposition grammatically. Apostrophe S here is a possessive marker or genitive marker, but they alternate a lot and they cover a lot of the same semantic ground. So we also include these possessives. So pages of the book or the book's pages, these are part-whole relations. And there's a technical aspect, which is that in some cases we assign two labels to a token to distinguish the sort of semantic role with respect to a scene and the more lexical information that the preposition is signaling. I'm not going to get into this today, but look at the paper if you're interested. How am I doing on time? 12:30. OK, I'm going to try to move a little faster now. Here is, after many years of back and forth, here is our current inventory. It has 50 of these labels for that we are going to use to disambiguate with. I'm not going to give you even a tiny bit of the gory linguistic work that had to go into this with lots of discussions and weekly conference calls since 2014. But the gist of this is that, so we call this the semantic network of adposition and case supersenses. It's this hierarchy structure. SNACS is for short. So you see that it has these three different regions. One is called circumstance for things that often modify events, so like place and time and means and manner and purpose and stuff like that tend to modify events. Then we have participant, which tends to be core arguments and events like agent and theme and stimulus and experiencer and recipient. And then we have configuration, which tends to be for things that are relations between nominals. And so traditionally, there was sort of the semantic role labeling literature, which dealt with the first two categories, and then the relations between nominals literature, which dealt with the last one. So we had to do some work to bring them into unity. Here are some annotation procedure details. We started out with University of Colorado Boulder students who already had done some linguistic annotation. We trained them with our guidelines. We improved the guidelines as we were going. We measured inter-annotator agreement over time, and it was in the 60s and 70s range at that point. As the guidelines got better, agreement went up and so forth. Also, this was with our older hierarchy, which had 75 categories, so we hope the new one is a lot better. But the upshot is we have a corpus data set called STREUSLE for Supersense Tagged Repository of English with a unified semantics for lexical expressions. For those of you who may not know, this is a picture of STREUSLE, spelled EL, or STREUSLE in German, which is cinnamon sugar topping on baked goods. And this is because lexical semantics is delicious. I keep bringing up food. I don't know. So this is annotated on top of online reviews. So from the English Web Tree Bank. So it also has gold universal dependencies, but we've added the semantic annotations. And in my dissertation, which Noah alluded to, we did multi-word expression annotations. And then on top of that, we added some noun and verb supersenses, and relevant to this work, we added preposition and possessive supersenses. So it's a small corpus, but it's been very carefully annotated. And you can download it right here. And it's still undergoing improvements as we refine the scheme. So some actual examples. 3 weeks ago, burglars tried to gain entry into the rear of my home. We say that gain entry is a multi-word verb. And we want to annotate a go into of and my. And this is reasonably straightforward. So a go represents a time. Into represents a goal or destination. Rear of my home is a part-whole relation. And my indicates possession of home. But we frequently encounter difficult cases like somebody provided us with excellent service. So what is this with? Came with a great deal of knowledge and professionalism. What is this with? We call this one theme and this one characteristic, but there's a whole lot of details into how we came around to that. And this of represents a quantity. Our guidelines currently stand at 85 pages. So this is not an easy annotation task, not something we could just directly crowdsource. But luckily for me, I have a lot of linguistics students who like to do this kind of annotation. So, but in the future, we would very much like to find which parts of this annotation are simple enough that we could do it on a larger scale and then have experts only work on a small subset. I said that prepositions are not just about space and time. Here is a pie chart of spatial and temporal are only about a third of the tokens in our data. Now remember, this is online reviews, so people are talking about their experiences at restaurants. If they were talking about soccer matches, maybe there would be more space and time. But getting this rest of the pie is actually really important. Here are some of the types and of both single word and multi-word prepositions. And of course, deciding what should qualify as a multi-word preposition is challenging. Okay, audience participation. What do you think is the percentage of the token distribution represented by the top 10 types? So if you take the top 10 most frequent prepositions, what percentage of all the prepositions do they represent? So who thinks it's around between, I don't know, who thinks it's under 50%? Who thinks it's between 50 and 75%? Who thinks it's between 75% and 100? Okay, so the results are here. So if you look at the top 10, it's really about 75%. Very extreme long tail here, which is fun. But if we look instead at the semantic labels, their distribution is a little more even. I mean, we still have some low frequency ones, but it's a little more spaced out, which suggests that this is really something about the language, not about the meanings that are being conveyed. We also, as I mentioned, include possessives. There was some previous work on this. We are able to capture alternations like the pages of the book's pages, the murder of the boy's murder, and so forth. And this can actually, this data set, we hope will be used for more linguistic study of this alternation. I should also mention that we also have started annotating the little prints in English. And we have a more recent estimate of inter-annotator agreement, which is around, which is around 78%, depending on how you measure, which pair of annotators, and so forth. We think this is, close to being a pretty good level of agreement for a 50-way disambiguation task, but we're always trying to improve this. Okay, so now a few quick slides about disambiguation. This was in 2018, so we of course have a most frequent baseline. And then we did some very standard neural classification techniques as of 2018, which of course is now all changed. We did a BioSTM with a multi-layer perceptron classifier, and we also did an SVM with features based on Vivek's previous work. And what we're wondering here is just what is sort of the baseline difficulty of this task if you use machine learning. Here are some accuracies using, assuming we know which things are supposed to be considered prepositions, and we have gold syntax features, at least for the SVM model. So the most frequent baseline is actually quite low. You don't have to worry about the difference between these three columns, but basically the most frequent baseline is very low, and this shows that these prepositions are in fact very ambiguous. It's not just that the most frequent sense is 90% of the distribution or something. If we use some machine learning, it helps a lot. The context matters a lot. So here's our neural system, 70s or low 80s, depending on which measure you're using. And here is our SVM using features, about the same. If we looked at the frequent errors, and it was doing things like over-predicting the most frequent label, and also not getting the nuances right between some of these closely related categories. Like social rel is for relations between individuals versus relations between an individual and an organization, like you work for a company. And also these labels, which is sort of like more concrete possession, literal ownership versus more abstract forms of possession. Fortunately, some people from this area came along and applied contextualized word embeddings this year. So this paper, they used our data set and evaluated, assuming you knew which things should have preposition labels. They improved on our 60s and 70s numbers to get up to 80 to 90. So there's a lot of improvement you can get from contextualized embeddings, but GloVe by itself works terribly for some reason. Presumably because these things are so ambiguous, so just having non-contextualized representation is not going to buy you a whole lot. Actually, predicting which things should be treated as prepositions is not trivial, though, and because some of them are multi-word expressions, some of them are idiomatic, some of them are ambiguous with other parts of speech. So we're now working. I'm working with Nelson and my student Michael and some other people on trying to build a full sentence tagger that does all of this. Another interesting paper I want to give a shout out to was from StarSun this year, and this did not use our data set, but they looked at different classes of function words in natural language inference and different ways of pre-training and how this affects whether the natural language inference systems are reasoning correctly about these function words. And they found that pre-training matters a lot for prepositions. If you pre-train based on image captioning, it'll get some of the concrete senses, but not the abstract senses. Okay, with the maybe 5 minutes, or I guess I should wrap up very soon, but just a quick flavor of some of the extensions we're looking at to other languages. This is called Case and Adposition Representation for Multilingual Semantics, or CARMLs. These are the languages we've been looking at so far, the prepositional ones and the postpositional ones. To give you some intuition here, if you look at like 4 versus 2 in English and compare that with French, there are 3 major prepositions in French that translate as 2 or 4 a lot. And maybe if we have semantic labels, we can distinguish these different usages better than not. So this is kind of the vision, and this is why we're interested in looking at many different languages. Of course, we have to define exactly what counts as an adposition or case marker in these languages and deal with morphology and compounding and all kinds of interesting stuff. But the most interesting question is whether these semantic labels that we have really do generalize to other languages. We tried to make them fairly general. But, a couple examples of interesting things we've encountered. In Mandarin Chinese, we have an interesting system where there are sort of preposition-y, I think these are called coverbs, that can interact with sort of another modifier that's also preposition-y, which are called localizers. And so we had to decide how to analyze these. So you say something like, more generally, there's an at-like relation, and then you refine it by saying on top of. I don't speak Mandarin, but this is one interesting case, and some of the students at Georgetown have actually annotated the full little prints with the supersenses, and so we can start to look at cross-linguistic differences. For German, there's a really fun phenomenon where German has morphological case on nouns. It turns out there's an interaction between the preposition you use and the case of the object noun phrase in terms of the meaning. So if you want to talk about, if you use in as the preposition, you use the dative case for the noun if you are talking about a static location, and the accusative case if you're talking about a goal. So in dem Auto is in the car, in das Auto is into the car. And it applies the same way for a lot of these locative prepositions. So we have to worry about the case as well. And my student Jakob has annotated the little prints in German. And Korean, led by Jenna, is looking at many interesting phenomena where the labels we have for English don't necessarily suffice, including these pragmatic focus markers like only and also and even. So you can say, which are expressed postpositionally. So bread to, eat means eat bread also. Bread man eat means eat only bread. And there's a bunch of others as well. So this means we have to create some sort of additional set of labels for this. I'm going to skip over this. We have some quantitative preliminary numbers on how, on a very small sample of aligned prepositions across languages, we want to annotate more to get a better sense here. But moving forward, we're interested descriptively in what are the similarities and differences in adpositions and case systems across languages. Also, annotation efficiency. Can we make this very complex task simple, or at least partially, identify a simpler part of it and crowdsource it? And finally, we want to build models not only for English but cross-linguistically and apply them in applications. Some of these things we're also looking at are like looking at second language English, the adposition use and whether it differs and is influenced by the native language. We're looking at whether we can generalize these labels to apply to semantic roles that are not marked by prepositions. And a plug for a paper that my student has coming up at Connell is looking at the integration, so taking these labels and putting them into graph-structured meaning representations like UCA, where we have them annotated on the preposition, but they can be incorporated really as role labels. So please take a look at that if you will be at Connell. And we have results on different multitask sorts of architectures for parsing with this, this combined representation, and it turns out doing it all jointly is better. Okay, so to wrap up, I know I'm probably over time. I hope I've convinced you that adpositions and case markers are interesting and challenging and important for NLP in terms of their semantics, and we have a long way to go if we want to cover all these different languages and all these different facets. So thank you.
We have time for some questions.
All right.
How did you deal with phrasal verbs in English? So like, English has quite a lot of these where the sort of preposition that tacks onto a verb is very, very idiomatic and like leaches meaning as time goes on. So like hang up, look up, beat down. Like some of these are less opaque than others, but also you have this problem of they're not always right next to the verb. Like you can say, look my wife's doctor's dentist up, sort of thing. And then how did you deal with like this up really doesn't mean anything at all, I guess.
So great question. I took out a slide that addressed this. We previously did multi-word expression annotation. So we already had marked these idiomatic ones like look, blah, 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 up as a gappy multi-word expression. So in that case, we did not annotate the preposition semantically because we just treated it as a verb. But there are some borderline cases where it's hard to know whether, so if there was a spatial, like I brought the book up, meaning carried it up, then we would treat it as a spatial preposition because it's being used more productively there.
Right. It just seems difficult because a lot of the times they start with spatial meaning and then sort of just lose that historically, and you might get like border cases.
Well, this is why multi-word expressions are so interesting, and if the next time I come here, maybe I'll give a talk about that. I think Emily next. Oh, same question. Okay. Swap.
Yeah, so I really liked your motivation slide with the cartoon pig.
Yeah.
And computationally, there a lot of these, like you had that example for cat in the kitchen in the afternoon. So is it possible that the context itself tells you what the role of the preposition is, or have you seen a difference?
I mean, that's the hypothesis of being able to train a sentence level disambiguation system is that presumably what it's learning is that if you see in followed by a location-y thing, then it's a location reading of in, and if it's followed by 12 o'clock, then it's time. But it turns out it's really the factors there are very complex, so it's difficult to write a list of rules that capture all of that.
Sorry, I didn't mean the list of rules. I was talking about computational. If you have a sentence representation that just missed a preposition, like in.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So maybe you could have a meaning representation that would figure out its location without the preposition. Sure. I think there's always going to be this interplay between the preposition itself and the other things that help you figure out its meaning. I think what's interesting is that this helps us understand the sorts of things that actually are ambiguous and in what ways they can be ambiguous, and how this might affect translation of the preposition and things like that.
Do you have an idea for, if you were to potentially deploy this into sort of an open domain setting, like how much world knowledge would be an obstacle towards being able to actually do this
How
type
much
of
world knowledge would be an obstacle? I mean, we can come up with examples like I think the example of the DOJ subpoena example is really one that requires world knowledge. I think probably 99% of the cases are pretty local semantic information that is needed. But if you're looking at like, sometimes the preposition, we also annotate things that are not followed by a direct object. So I brought the book in. That doesn't have a direct object overtly. So that's going to be more challenging and require maybe more context to know into where, or is that spatial or is it something else? Yeah.
So this is very exciting math here, but it's also a little scary to think about your current process of kind of going one language at a time.
Yeah.
You have to get like a lot of grad students. So do you think there's some hope of this stuff projecting cross-lingually, or?
Yeah, this is something we want data with a bunch of languages so we can start experimenting with, algorithms to help us do this.
It sounds like you haven't had too many new classes yet. Is that just because you're in the early stages, or because we're hoping it's going to be quite universal?
Also, so for German and for German at least, the prepositions seem similar enough to English in how they're used that there probably are not going to be a whole lot of semantic domains that are now individual prepositions are going to be different, but the semantic domains that they express are going to be pretty similar. But looking at Korean and Japanese, I showed an example from Korean. There are a few other things in Korean that are really not expressed with English prepositions, or at least not as regularly expressed with English prepositions. So I think this is just something we have to do for a number of languages to see. Yeah.
So we're trying to, I guess, if one of our goals is to build systems that understand language in a similar way that humans do, I feel like with all these borderline cases, there is some sort of gap between like a system that can just provide labels that are pretty good for each preposition, and then a system that would do the same thing that humans do, which is see these borderline cases and become genuinely confused and start to think about all the different implications. Yeah. So there's this gap here that exists between our systems that just try to label examples and the humans who are trying to reason about what the labels should be. Like, and especially since agreement is still, I guess, around that 80%, like I imagine, like, is there a roadmap? Like, what do you think are the steps to improve that agreement number and bring the systems closer to what humans actually do?
Yeah, I mean, some of the disagreement, I was involved with some annotation this past summer, and some of the disagreements are just really fuzzy boundaries in the labels. If you want to represent like all the semantic relations that are expressed in language, there's going to be a lot of gray area that you cannot possibly tease apart perfectly. But we have found areas we can improve the guidelines, like possession. We had very vague definitions for possession versus the ownership sense versus the more general, like having a property or sort of sense. So yeah, I don't necessarily have a great answer other than partially improving guidelines. It would be interesting to have a data set of things that are really ambiguous to humans and that cause different readings. But in my experience with annotation, it's less that there are wildly different readings and more that humans are not sure of the boundaries of the labels.
Okay, in the interest of time, we should thank our first speaker. And switch over to our second speaker. And for people who want to make a graceful exit, this is your. Okay, so while we do the microphone switch, I'm delighted to introduce Vivek Srikumar, who is an assistant professor of computer science at the University of Utah. Vivek previously was a postdoc at Stanford working with Chris Manning, and before that did his PhD at UIUC with Dan Roth. If my memory serves, you may be the only person in the room who saw my first job talk. Or maybe you're not that old. No. Okay. I probably missed it by a year. You probably missed it by a year, or you had something better to do.
So,
okay. Okay, I'll start over. Apparently the people on the internet can't hear me right now. Sorry. Yeah, I'll do it again, and this time you guys can laugh even harder. I'll spare everybody.
I'm waiting for the thumbs up.
Okay, I'm delighted to introduce Vivek Srikumar, in case you missed his name, who is an assistant professor of computer science at the University of Utah. Prior to that, he did a postdoc at Stanford, and his PhD is from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Vivek has contributed widely in NLP, focusing on machine learning. He's one of the people who successfully rode the wave from linear models to nonlinear models, with great contributions on both sides of that ever-widening divide. And we're delighted to have him with us today. Today he's going to talk us about what logic can teach to neural networks. So welcome.
Great, thanks. I'm going to talk about some recent work. So I see that Nathan has taken about 10 minutes of my time, so I'll probably...
We also started late.
So, no, what I was going to say is we should probably lock the door. Because I was making my slides, and at last count it was like at 70 or something. So anyway, I'm going to talk about some recent work on logic and neural networks. This has been a hobby of mine for a few years. This is joint work with my students Tao Li, Vivek Gupta, and Maitrey Mehta. So if you've been following the news, neural networks can understand text. I'm going to use this task of textual entailment as an example through the talk. You're given, if you've not seen this task before, you have a premise, a sentence, and a hypothesis, and the goal is to decide whether the premise entails the hypothesis or it contradicts the hypothesis or none of the above. And if you take a state-of-the-art system of this for this task, this is a screenshot from the Allen NLP demo. It tells you that the premise entails the hypothesis, which is nice, with a fair amount of confidence. If you believe this, then I have some news for you. The question that I've been trying to think about is this just an artifact of some sort of something magical happening in the neural network, or do these systems really understand language? So here's a probe. Instead of 2 sentences, let's take 3. You have 3 sentences, P, H, and Z, and John is on a train to Berlin. John is traveling to Berlin, so P entails H. John's traveling to Berlin. John's having lunch in Berlin. Can't happen at the same time, so H contradicts Z. But if you go to the demo now, it will probably say that P contradicts Z. So if John is on a, P and Z are unrelated, which is a violation of some sort of consistency invariant that we expect. If the first sentence entails the second and the second one contradicts the third, the first should contradict the third. It turns out that this is not just one example. On a collection of hundreds of thousands of examples, we trained a model with BERT, and that gets like 90% on SNLI. It's at near the top of the leaderboard, at least at the time we did it. About half of those examples violate this sort of simple rule that we can write down. So here's a rule in logic that the system does not know. So the question that motivates this line of work is, how do we provide such, let's call it advice if you want, to neural networks? Here's another example with reading comprehension. We have some text and we have a question, and one approach for solving this problem, one class of models, what they do is they try to align words and phrases in the question with the paragraph, and then try to follow the pointers to see what happens. So writing prose is related to being an author of Latin prose, and long story short, the answer is Julius Caesar. But this is nice. I mean, in fact, systems can get this answer, but what if I would like to inform the system that if you have 2 words that are related to each other, then try to align them. Don't rely on a million labeled examples. Here's a piece of information that you can just use. If we have this information, how do we inform this? How do we inform models with this? So in this talk, I'm going to talk about this idea of going from learning from examples, which is the dominant way in which neural networks are trained today, to learning with rules. Not learning from rules, but with rules. And for that, we need to think about how neural networks and logic interact with each other, and that will be the bulk of the talk. And at the end, I'll talk about some examples with involving text understanding. So how do we go from learning with how do we learn with rules? The reason I'm interested in this question is because I would like to build neural networks without massive data sets. They are awesome if you have a lot of data and a lot of compute, but what if I don't have data? Instead, I have an expert who can write down some rules without too much effort. So how do we integrate domain knowledge with these sort of data set driven learning. And the reason for this is because, first of all, good data sets are really not that easy to make. It takes some effort to make a good data set, and years of work, and a lot of people. Thanks, Nathan. The second, and so what I'm getting at is it is impossible for us to have a data set for every task and every domain and every language out there, so we need something else. The second observation is that it's often easy to write down rules about what we want models, how we want models to behave. So for example, in textual entailment, I could say if none of the content words in the hypothesis have any strong alignment with anything in the premise, the label cannot be entail or contradict. It has to be unrelated. These kinds of statements are often statements in logic. In fact, you can think of these as statements in first order logic that describe invariants about the problem, not the data set. And these are often universally, like I said, universally quantified, and but not necessarily. So what we need is the ability to use these kinds of rules and integrate it with data of this kind and build models. So for that we need neural networks to meet logic. So let's briefly look at neural networks and logic. If you missed the agenda, neural networks are awesome because they allow for differentiable compute. So you can essentially throw it at backpropagation and wait till it gets you a good model. In some sense, it provides an easy interface to use. However, they are kind of hard to supervise because mostly they accept labeled examples. First order logic, on the other hand, does not involve calculus. It's hard to beat it into TensorFlow. However, it's easy to state. I mean, people are, domain experts can write down these kinds of things, and it's pretty expressive. So what we want is everything. What we would like is differentiable learning that is easy to use, namely with the best software that's out there today, and all the cool advances on embeddings and representations and all that, and at the same time use logic to guide the learning. So of course, I mean, it's not like this is the first time logic has made its way into logic and constraints, and such things have made their way into learning. And the way I see it, there are a few different places in which logic can get involved. It could somehow help us design the models. Think, for example, the neural network architecture is somehow informed by some sort of a constraint that we have. It could influence what loss function we minimize and how we train. It could also constrain how predictions are made. We could constrain predictions to be only those that satisfy some constraints. The last one is essentially structured prediction. It's fun. However, with neural models, training can be a bit difficult because logic is discrete. And the other problem is, if we go that way, every time we make a prediction in the future, we need to have this sort of constrained inference, so there's a computational cost. Not saying it's not good, because I do that also, but in this talk, I'm going to talk about the first two. I'll talk about how we can augment neural networks with logic, and how we can essentially use logic-based design of loss functions. This is stuff that was at ACL and EMNLP this year. I assume that I have very little time and I'm going way faster than I had planned, so we can feel free to interrupt and ask questions and such things, and then I can hurry at the end. All right, so there are 3 different challenges that we have to address in order to integrate logic with neural models. The first one is, how do we bridge predicates in logic, or predicates that are inside the rules that we write, with whatever is happening inside the neural networks? The second one is this question about differentiability. How do we make logic differentiable? And the third one is, suppose we did that, how do we use it? I'm going to address each of these one at a time. So let's go to the first one. I'd like to argue that every neural network exposes some sort of an interface. You can think of this as nodes that have meaning that is that independent of the neural network. So let me illustrate this with an example. So this is a dummy neural network that takes a premise and a hypothesis and predicts the textual entailment label. If you want, you can think of the inside of this as some big BERT or something like that. You can think of outputs as predicates. Here, the prediction that this is an entailment can be seen as a predicate that called entail that has two arguments, the premise and the hypothesis. You can think of the neural network as assigning a probability that that predicate is true. You can also write down predicates about the inputs. The inputs are also part of the interface that the neural network exposes, and you can write down things like John is a person. That's a predicate. But also, if you want to open up the black box, maybe the neural network has some sort of attention. So the cartoon here is that words are encoded into vectors. These are these vertical lines. Both the premise and the hypothesis are encoded into vectors, and then there's some attention in the middle, and together all of these things somehow are blended together and you get a label. This is a cartoon version of the decomposable attention model, for example. By design, we can think of these attention edges as alignments. So the fact that there is an edge between, say, traveling and train can be written as the predicate that says these two things are aligned. And we can think of the attention as a probability that this alignment should exist. So either way, I would like to call these kinds of nodes in the network, either the attention or the output, or maybe even these non-existent nodes that are really properties of the input, I would like to call them named neurons. In a computation graph, these are nodes that have some externally defined meaning. So if you want to think of this edge that connects these two phrases, notable author and known for writing, the neural network might have a node in that, let's call that little a, and it's associated with a predicate that says these two words are aligned. So this attention is, in this case, the alignment. Matter of convention, I'll use lowercase for neurons and uppercase for predicates. Not every node in the network needs to be named. There could be anonymous units of compute that are just whatever backpropagation wants it to be, but we are interested in those nodes that we are able to assign meaning for. And this could be a controversial idea because maybe we don't want to do that, but I'm going to argue that invariably we have it either a priori by design, like in this case attention, or post hoc we might analyze a neural network and discover that a certain node is the cat neuron, and then we might want to write constraints about that. So the named neurons give us the vocabulary for writing rules. These will be the predicates that these will constitute the predicates that we have for writing rules, and this would be the bridge between neural networks and the logical constraints that we have. So that answers the first question. So we have neurons that have some meaning and we want to write rules about that. The second one is actually the slightly more tricky one, and I realize now that that's the one that I have the least amount of material on, but most amount of references for. What we need is to make logic differentiable. Thankfully, this has been the object of study for nearly a century now, starting with the work of Jan Lukasiewicz, and it has taken multiple names in the past. I've been using this notation from this book called triangular norms. You can call them T norms. The idea is we want to systematically relax logic into functions that are hopefully continuous and maybe differentiable even. to do that, what we need is to relax every operator that we have. There are only 3 of them. If you squint your eyes, there might be 4. We need to handle negations, conjunctions, disjunctions, and implications. And the good news is that if you like choice, there are many, many such relaxations. I'll just walk through one of them, the product T-norm. If I have a predicate capital A, when A is true, 1 minus A is, when A, assuming that true is 1 and false is 0, when A is 1, 1 minus A is 0, and so 1 minus A is a good representation for negation, and this is a relaxation that applies even when A is not 0 or 1. In general, you should think of T-norms here as a relaxation for the conjunction, and once you get negation and conjunctions, you get the rest of the Boolean operators. And every single system here has some interesting properties, and it's developed in this axiomatic way. The important point here is that Booleans, in the Boolean case, inputs and outputs live in, they can either be zeros or ones. In the relaxed version of it, the inputs and outputs are in the range 0 to 1. And like I said, there are different kinds of T-norms. In the work that I'm describing, we used product in one case and Lukasiewicz in another. There's been some work from Sebastian Riedel's group over the last couple of years that uses the Gödel T-norm because it has some interesting connections to adversarial learning. Anyway, so there's like a lot of cool things you can do with this, and if you're interested, you can just look up the references. Oh, another interesting thing here is the Lukasiewicz logic is basically built out of rectified linear units. So that's your connection to neural networks. So you can construct rectified linear units and plug them into neural networks, and that's kind of nice. And it also has some other really cool properties that we can talk about offline. All right, so what we have here is a system of relaxations of logic, and now, oh, by the way, these are only 3 of the T-norms. There are an infinite number of them. Not all of them are continuous, not all of them are differentiable. We are going to just focus on the ones that are continuous and differentiable because that's the world we know how to navigate. So if we want to make logic differentiable, the answer is pick a T-norm and run with it. Okay, what does it mean to run with it? How do we use these things? So what can logic do for me? In general, I think constraints and logic and rules, or whatever you want to call them, introduce inductive bias. They make learning easier and less reliant on training data. So in this case, we can introduce inductive bias by either changing the shape of the neural network, the architecture of itself, so that the network ends up preferring parameters that satisfy constraints, or by we can use the logic to define a regularizer that guides the model to regions of the model space, parameter space that satisfy constraints. And I'm going to go over these one at a time. So the first one showed up in ACL, and instead of going through the gory details, I'm going to just give you a cartoon example. So imagine that we have a neural network here, and imagine there are many, many nodes that are not here on the slide. There is a layer with all the A's and there's a layer with all the B's, and in between them there are many layers that don't concern us. B1, the node at the top, is of special interest to us because it is, let's say, the input to B1. The layer that's just before B1 is some X, whatever it might be. So we have, and in the absence of any other information, the neural network does what it does. Let's say in addition to this, we also have that one constraint that says if A1 and A2 are true, then B1 should be true. Importantly, this rule says that information from A1 and A2 can impact B1 independent of what happens in these intervening layers. Of course, the network can learn this information. They are expressive enough to learn anything, apparently. So they can learn this constraint, but then the question is, why should you learn what we already know? So let me illustrate how we can introduce this constraint into the neural network. First thing we can do is we can take the left hand side of this constraint and write it down in Lukasiewicz. I'm calling that D. D of A1 and A2 is essentially a function that says how true is the conjunction. For example, if A1 and A2 are both true, then this whole thing becomes 1. If A1 and A2 are both high, D becomes high. If both of them are low, then D is turned off. And then we define a constrained layer. We're going to change the B1 node. We're going to define a constrained layer that says there are two parts to the input to B1. Let's call it B1 prime. There is the original input, that is the dot product of the weights and its previous layer, plus this the node D that is regulated by some rho. Think of D as a soft constraint. If D is high, what happens is the pre-activation value of this B1 prime gets high, which means B1 becomes true, more true. If D is 0, then A1 and A2 is false. Then we can't say anything about the value of B because the constraint is true if irrespective of whether B is true or false. In that case, we let the network do what it wants. If A1 and A2 is false, the D becomes 0, which means if I can find my mouse pointer, or this term here becomes 0, so the network just goes with what it has. And what I'm arguing for is essentially replace, go to your neural network, just replace all the nodes that have B in them to something like this. You introduce a new node, D, that is essentially the Lukasiewicz conjunction, and in addition to the inputs that are already there, you also have a new edge. This is a systematic process that we can do without adding any additional training parameters. The rho here is a single hyperparameter that you essentially can think of as how much do you trust your constraint. If rho is high, I really want my constraint to be true, or I really believe my constraint. If rho is low, I'm not entirely sure what it is. So there are no additional parameters that are required, and the nice thing is this is essentially a compilation step. You create a computation graph in TensorFlow or whatever, and add these constraints and just glue these extra nodes in there, and they could work. And I mean, I'm talking about it, so they did work at least twice, 3 times. All right, so that's one way of changing a neural network, essentially change the architecture, or that's one way of introducing logic into a neural network, that is by saying reconstruct the network to kind of prefer logic. Yeah?
How do you deal with existential quantifiers this way? Because all those things are kind of universal.
Which
like if you add this rule you're saying for...
Right. So I don't know actually. In this way of doing things, there are some pretty heavy constraints on what kinds of logical formulae can be used. In particular, one interesting thing is that whatever happens, we need to keep this graph acyclic. So if you are not careful about it, you could have some constraint that says A1 and A2 implies B, and B1 and B2 implies A3, and some weird cyclicity could show up. So this is a somewhat restricted operation, and frankly speaking, I'm not saying that this is the end of it. I don't know. Yeah. Yes.
Isn't it hard to identify the nodes?
Yes.
Which might be...
Right. So that's the question of these named neurons. I'm assuming that A1, A2, and B1 are named neurons, and that is really the slightly tricky part. The assumption here is that as the person who's designing the network, maybe I have some intuition about what's going on. When we were working on this work was done pre-BERT, or pre-BERT becoming popular. So it was not, you have all these attentions and alignments, and it was kind of easy to think about it. And I've been thinking for a few months now about how this idea would work with these 12 layers of transformers, or whatever, 20 layers of transformers, and I don't know. Yes, you're right. This works if we have these interfaces that are well defined. However, one class of constraints that we did introduce, and it turned out to be helpful surprisingly, was just connecting the inputs to the outputs. In a text chunking task, for example, we added a constraint that says if a word is a noun, then it should not be in anything but an NP. You don't need to understand what's going on inside the thing. My gut reaction was this is not going to help because somehow the thing is going to learn it. It turned out it actually helped in the low data regime. So it kind of helps. Yes?
When defining the named neurons, do you take into account semantic similarity with the predicates, or is there a way of capturing relationships between the predicates?
I haven't thought that far. Maybe yes. I didn't think about it. So I would like to say yes, but that is without any activity in my head. So I don't know. One could argue that the constraints are capturing the relationships between the predicates, and they take care of that, but that is a cop-out. So let's say maybe. All right, so that's one way of modifying this network by just augmenting the network itself. The other way is to acknowledge that it's hard to find named neurons that are that are there, and also I realize that our models today can essentially learn anything. They can also learn the constraints. They can some maybe layer 4 in BERT is good at logic. I don't know, and let's just let the learner figure it out. So the idea here is to kind of change the process of learning so that regularization, so that we design regularizers using constraints. This is going to show up at EMNLP, and to do this we need sort of a unified representation of both examples and constraints in logic. So one could see that a labeled example is really a predicate about a particular pair of a particular input. So if I have a pair of sentences P and H that are that an annotator has declared to be an entailment, I can write this down as a predicate entail PH. This is a statement that we would like models to preserve. Or equivalently, I could say true implies entail PH. That's just a technicality. Constraints are also naturally in this form. If I can say that if P entails H and H entails Z, then P should entail Z. So if you have 3 sentences, the first one entails the second entails the third, the first entails the third. These are universally quantified statements. If we have statements of this kind, or everything here is of the form left entails right. So you have at the top you have true implies entail, and here you have some left hand side implies the right hand side. The thing at the top is labeled examples, the thing at the bottom they are rules. Together we can with some mild technical details that we can talk about offline, examples and constraints are essentially a humongous conjunction. This conjunction contains the entire training set, but it also contains rules of the kind of this type, right? This gives us an idea for a learning goal. This is a statement that we would like to be true. In other words, among all models that can exist, we prefer models that set this conjunction to be true, because this is essentially all my data and all my constraints together. Among all models, I want models that prefer this to be true, but I can't search over models directly, so instead I can just literally apply the idea that we saw before, take a t-norm relaxation of this conjunction, and I want that relaxation to be as high as possible, because among all models I want models that can set this thing to be as true as possible. That gives you this that gives us a definition or the beginning of what we are calling an inconsistency loss, or a family of inconsistency losses. Essentially, an inconsistency loss is a constraint driven loss that is compiled from rules. If we have universally quantified constraints, what we get is actually a regularizer. If we have labeled examples, we have something that penalizes mistakes or penalizes models that make mistakes. In fact, a very cool result that's actually pretty easy to show is that if we use the product denorm with labeled examples, we get cross entropy loss. So this is essentially another way to invent the cross entropy loss. I tried connecting hinge loss also to something else, but something didn't work out. Anyway, so the nice thing is at this point what we have is we just have a loss function that we have to minimize. This is just a continuous function. It's a differentiable function. We can throw it at we can use any neural model. We can use any library and any optimizer. So all we have to do is systematically compile statements of that kind using a particular t-norm into inconsistency loss. So this is all I'm going to talk about inconsistency, or about the technical details. We can discuss this offline if you want. In the 4 or so minutes I have left, I'm going to rush through a bunch of experiments. So the question really is, do these things help neural networks? The papers have results on reading comprehension and chunking, but I'm just going to focus on natural language inference. The first case study involves this idea of augmenting a model, where we have a model and we have modified it using some constraints. We trained the decomposable attention model on the SNLI data set, and there are two constraints, both of which use the premise and hypothesis words that we have, so PI and HJ. One constraint says if two words are related, they should be aligned. For any PI and HJ, related of PI and HJ implies align them. The second constraint says for any, this is the one example that I had, if no content word in the hypothesis is aligned to something in the premise, then the label cannot be entailed because there's no sharing of information. These are the only two constraints we have. They are both easy to write, and honestly we didn't spend too much time thinking about them. These were literally the first things we thought about. So the question that I'm interested in all the experiments is, what is the value of these constraints? I'm arguing that constraints and rules and logic, whatever you want to call them, are more helpful when we have less data, because that's the situation where the neural networks have to somehow get the signal from somewhere. So the experiments essentially use different percentages of the training set. The first bar here is the original model, the second bar, the red one, is with the constraint, and a few interesting observations. The first one is constraints often help, almost always, especially in the low data regimes. When the training set is small, the improvements are actually pretty high. Also interesting is when we have a lot of training data, maybe you don't need the constraints because the training data just somehow gets this information. So one result here is if you have a huge data set, maybe just believe the data. If you don't have a lot of data, maybe start thinking about these sort of inference mechanisms. Another experiment involves consistency of natural language inference. In this case, we trained BERT based models on the union of SNLI and multi-NLI data sets. And there were two kinds of constraints here. The first one, we call them symmetry, which says if you have two sentences, if the first one contradicts the second, then the second one should contradict the first. Seems like a reasonable thing. And notice that in the traditional worldview, these are two separate predictions. Nothing forces any model to mark P and H to be contradict and H and P to be contradict. It's possible that this could be violated. And then we had four transitivity constraints of the form that we saw before. If P entails H and H entails Z, then P should entail Z. All of these are universally quantified once again. In order to evaluate, we have two kinds of evaluations. First is we can measure the accuracy of these things. The second one is we can ask how often do trained models violate this kind of a constraint. So we can ask what is the inconsistency with respect to some sort of a rule. So if you have, I'm defining inconsistency essentially as a fraction of examples where the left hand side of the rule is true but the right hand side is not. So I have a rule that says L implies R, and if L is true, that's really this circle here, and if R is false, that's this region here, that's bad. And we can measure the fraction of those things, and that is a measure of inconsistency. One thing that we found that's interesting is no matter what we did, the accuracy of the BERT models don't improve. They're pretty awesome. However, the models are pretty lousy with respect to their consistency. So the symmetry, which is a contradiction of A and B implies contradiction of B and A, is violated like 71% of the times if we train a model on 1% of the data. And even if we throw in 100% of the examples, which is like, I don't know, I think 500,000 examples or more, it's still pretty bad. It's like 60% of the time the model does not know that if one sentence contradicts another, the other one should contradict the first. Adding the regularizer in all cases, that's this line here, helps. The transitivity consistency is actually not violated that much. It's comparatively the numbers are smaller, but even that's surprisingly bad. I would have thought this is something in the model should know this information. And the good news again is adding this regularizer helps. So two takeaway lessons. The first one is just adding more training data does not help with evaluations that focus on a broader behavior of the models, on how models interact with even its own predictions or maybe with other models' predictions. The second one is these systematically introduced regularizers actually reduce these kinds of inconsistencies, which is nice to see. So in the -2 minutes I have, let me start wrapping up. Meaning representations are hard, and neural networks treat meaning as boxes with circles in them, like the thing here. And I would like to point out that maybe logic can be seen as the language that connects representations of that kind, the structured kind, with these vector valued representations, and this could be a channel for introducing information. I really like that quote from Stanislaw Ulam, I think, which when I found that I was thinking, yeah, the whole thing is just bogus. Anyway, just to wrap up, logic's a convenient language to convey information to models. It would be nice if neural networks and logic can play nice with each other, and one way of doing that is to take logics to the neural network land by relaxing them. Once we get these relaxations, we can systematically augment the model, or we can modify how the training happens to make them make models more consistent. Either way, I encourage you to think about consistency of models and self-consistency of models, because maybe just measuring accuracy is misleading us. All right, I'll stop now. Thanks, and I'll be happy to take questions.
So for the transitivity constraint, you need like 3 sentences, but I guess the sentences come in pairs.
Yes.
So how did you instantiate those?
So good question. So first of all these constraints that are, I have 2 answers for that. The first one is that all these constraints that are universally quantified don't need labeled examples. I can just go to the wild because it's true for all triples. This is essentially a constraint that is true for all 3 sentences. So it is universally quantified, which means I can, in theory, I could go out there and pick 3 random sentences and force this constraint to be true. In practice, that's not a great idea, because if you pick 3 random sentences, chances are everything is neutral, and so the constraint is trivially true. So we went to, I think, MS Coco, and we had 3 sentences for each, multiple sentences for each image, and we picked 3 of those, which are kind of close to each other. And one interesting thing is that I strongly believe if you choose the right kinds of sentences that you write this regularizer over or inputs, the impact could be higher. And that is connected to, for example, work from Sebastian Riedel, where they try to find examples. And using the Godalty norm, that gives a natural way of doing it. But yes, in theory, yes, it could be for all triples. Yeah.
For the symmetry rule, are there any issues with sort of discourse effects, or like the hypothesis might have a pronoun that doesn't get an interpretation when you switch the order?
I don't know if that happens often enough to be a problem.
This is an issue, for example, in the COPA data set.
Right. I'm not sure if it is an issue in the SNLI type world, but in theory, yes, that's true. And in fact, that's one of the reasons when I was describing this constraint to someone, they said, oh, but that's not going to be true, because the way in which these sentences are laid out might be, the ordering might be fixed. Yes. But I don't, SNLI is simple enough that it doesn't happen, that's not a problem.
Yeah. So you mentioned that, like, in the full data case, it looked like if you were dealing with, at least in the numbers you showed, like more than 10% of the data, incorporating these constraints, like, decreased performance. But it seems like that implies that, at least for the metric that you were showing, like, using the full data without the constraints, like, the model increases its performance in part by violating these constraints?
Quite possibly. These constraints are, in fact, I had a slide here that said these constraints are really just suggestions. Yeah. And it's possible that the model, maybe the data violates these constraints, which is an interesting thing in its own. Right. Can I just, one other thing about that is that the way this whole thing is set up is that the model is allowed to violate constraints. As a result, it's possible that the model learns to violate the constraint or ignore it, because these are all soft constraints. So maybe it's hard to say whether the data is problematic or maybe the model has just decided to ignore the constraints.
Yeah, I guess for, like, the two constraints that you listed, though, like, both of them seemed fairly reasonable.
Oh, actually, no. I'm glad you think so, but
okay.
Yeah. So both of them are fairly problematic.
Okay.
The first one is this one, notion of relatedness. How do we know whether two words are related? We used ConceptNet, which is neither sound nor complete. So, that introduces noise. Here, following the previous talk, it's not only content words that carry information. So it's possible that this is too strong a constraint. So in both cases, it's possible that violations of these constraints are okay. When we first came up with these constraints, I thought exactly as you did. Yeah, this seems like necessary but not sufficient kind of thing. But the resources are noisy enough that it's neither necessary nor sufficient. First, Verit.
I thought of trying to train these on the old RT datasets.
On what?
On the old RT datasets, the very small ones.
Yeah, good question. I definitely thought of it.
They're much smaller than the 10% of the.
In fact, interestingly, the old RT datasets are roughly about as big as the 1%. And I think I evaluated on it, but did not train on it because we had some trouble finding the training set for reasons that are not technical. There was some methodological issue or something that was nothing conceptually impossible about that.
Another comment was about if there are no aligned words, then it couldn't be detailed, or maybe also couldn't be contradicting. I don't know. There's a subtlety between the SNLI definition of entailment and the old definition of entailment that you could have possibly two sentences that are unrelated and they would still be marked as contradicting because they assume that the two sentences must describe the same event.
Right.
While in the old RT datasets, this rule would be true, I think, for most examples.
That's right. So this is an interesting point. In fact, I think the fact that you're thinking about that point makes me happy, because in some sense we want to be able to use these kinds of signals directly and tell the models. And in some sense, what you just described is two different constraints for two different definitions of the task. So yes. I don't know.
I'm just curious how adding predicates affect their training time.
It didn't matter. So for these ones, for let's just go through both of these. For the first case, when we are augmenting the structure, we are essentially, nothing is changing in the training time, because there are no new parameters to be trained. The model is almost the same size, so it doesn't matter so much. I mean, the network is almost the same size because we are adding a very few extra nodes. Here we are adding extra regularizers, so we have to, that changes the training time, because the extra regularizers are, are essentially huge summations. That increases the training time, but it does not increase it as much as, say, had I had inference during training. So it's still pretty reasonable. If I remember right, it took a couple of hours on a GPU that's a few years old for training the 1% model, for example. It was not bad enough that I had to think about it. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're basically out of time, and Vivek and Nathan are around in town at least today and tomorrow, so send them a note if you didn't get time on the schedule. Maybe they will have more time for their chat. Thanks both for a great time.